With Ukraine running out of ammunition, as said by President Biden, Kyiv will further resort to using cluster munitions that will be provided by the United States. But the Prime Minister of Cambodia has asked both countries not to use such weapons, reminding them of the painful experience of his country that risked the lives of Cambodians up to this day. Sandy Abejuela reports.
The world has been reminded of the pain that Cambodia went through from cluster munitions dropped by the United States here in the country 50 years ago, with Prime Minister Hun Sen calling on America to provide such weapons and for Ukraine not to use them, as it will have serious consequences for the civilian population of Ukraine for decades. Prime Minister Hun Sen on his Twitter account said he was alarmed after reading reports that America would supply cluster munitions to help Ukraine in its fight against Russia. In his Twitter post, Hun Sen said, and quote, "If this is true, it could be the greatest danger to the Ukrainian people for decades or even hundreds of years if the cluster munitions were used in Russian-occupied territory." According to the Cambodian Prime Minister, the painful experience of his country, which was banned by the United States in the early 1970s, and its repercussion endured for more than 5 decades, has not been completely eradicated. And that quote, "I know for sure that Cambodia is small and weak, but out of compassion for the people of Ukraine, I call on the President of the United States, the donors, and the President of Ukraine, the recipient, to refrain from using cluster munitions in this war, because the real victims are the Ukrainian people." End of quote. One netizen commented on the Prime Minister's post, saying that most media outlets never mentioned that Russia has also been using cluster munitions since the first day of the conflict. To this, Prime Minister Hun Sen replied, quote, "If Russia is wrong, we should not do as Russia does, because the victims will be the people of Ukraine." End of quote. Cambodia's painful memory of the past refers to the time that America dropped bombs in an attempt to hit communist bases in the 60s and 70s. And following the 3-decade-long civil war which ended in 1998, Cambodia is among the countries worst affected by landmines, explosive remnants of war, or ERW, and cluster munitions. The effects of the bombing campaign launched by the United States and minefields left from the conflict have been felt by the Cambodians. The Cambodian Mine Action Victim Assistance Authorities, or CMAA's, latest reports show that from 1979 to April 2023, landmine, ERW, and cluster bomb explosions claimed 19,819 human lives and either injured or amputated 45,198 others in Cambodia. Reports citing Heng Ratana, Director General of Cambodian Mine Action Center, or CMAC, said that there are over 30 million cluster munitions deployed in Cambodia during the Cold War, as well as Vietnam and Laos. Cambodia is still removing hundreds of thousands of explosive remnants of war, with the government promising to clear all mines and unexploded ordnance by the year 2025. Some 700 square kilometers of Cambodia's territory still have remnants of the cluster munition, and these weapons are difficult to locate and remove, as it is one of the most challenging in Cambodia's post-war recovery efforts. Rika Prichinumpen, Sandy Abejuela, SMNI News, Cambodia.
The United States will continue with its plan to send forbidden weapons of war to help Ukrainians in its fight against Russian forces, despite opposition from NATO allies and international organizations. Meanwhile, America also said that Ukraine is not yet ready to join the NATO alliance. Carlo de la Peña tells us more.
The White House on Friday announced that the U.S. will supply Ukraine with cluster-style artillery rounds with the aim of exerting pressure on Russia to de-escalate the conflict and to help Ukraine with weapons. The move to provide these forbidden weapons of war is part of America's new military aid package worth $800 million for Ukraine, which includes the provision of cluster munitions. The package reportedly includes 155mm artillery rounds, including dual-purpose improved conventional munitions or DPICM, and 105mm artillery rounds. But what are cluster munitions, and why is it considered a forbidden weapon of war? Cluster munitions are banned in more than 100 countries, including some NATO members, under the UN Convention on Cluster Munitions signed in 2008 and took effect in 2010. The agreement prohibits the use, stockpiling, or transfer of such weapons, as it releases many bomblets over a vast area once they detonate. These unexploded elements thus pose severe risks to civilians that will span for years. The munitions have also caused controversies over their failure or dud rate, and unexploded mini-bombs can linger on the ground for years, even decades, and then detonate indiscriminately. Countries like Russia and Ukraine have not joined the UN treaty. US has also not joined the ban but has prohibited exports of such ammo with a dud rate or bomblet failure rates of more than 1%. It can be noted that the US president can override such prohibitions in cases that are deemed in the interests of the national security of US. And according to the US Department of Defense report, the US Army has about 638.3 million cluster submunitions, while the US Marine Corps has about 53.3 million. America's move to provide cluster munitions to Kyiv is in contrast to what the White House said early on in the conflict when asked about Russia's use of cluster munitions. On February 28, 2022, former White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki said that the use of cluster munitions could potentially be regarded as a war crime.
There are reports of illegal cluster bombs and vacuum bombs being used by the Russians. If that's true, what is the next step of this administration, and is there a red line for how much violence will be tolerated against civilians in this manner that's illegal and potentially a war crime?
It would be. I don't have any confirmation of that. We have seen the reports. If that were true, it would potentially be a war crime.
But more than a year since the conflict started, the Biden administration decided to provide such weapons to Ukraine. In an exclusive interview with CNN, US President Joe Biden defended his country's move to send cluster munitions to Ukraine, saying that it was a very difficult decision to make. Biden added the US had first consulted with its allies, stressing that Ukraine is running out of ammunitions, which is why the United States is sending them, and that it had taken him a while to be convinced to do it. But he had done it because they are running out of ammunition. However, many of America's allies strongly expressed their opposition to the said decision, and these include NATO members Canada, the United Kingdom, and Germany. The United States, as well as the EU member countries Austria and Spain, also opposed America's move. The Human Rights Watch also urged the US not to proceed with its decision and criticized both Russia and Ukraine for using cluster munitions in the conflict. The United States, however, will continue to push through with its decision, and when asked about the potential harm to the civilian population that the cluster munitions would inflict in Ukraine, Undersecretary of Defense for Policy Colin Kahl said, "The worst thing for civilians in Ukraine is for Russia to win."
And look, I'm as concerned about the humanitarian circumstance as anybody. But the worst thing for civilians in Ukraine is for Russia to win the war. And so it's important that they don't.
According to the official, Ukraine made a written promise not to use the munitions in civilian-populated areas. Russia has condemned America's decision and called it as an act of desperation, but it believes that it will not affect its ongoing military operations in Ukraine. Meanwhile, US President Joe Biden said that Ukraine is not ready to join NATO, the intergovernmental military alliance of countries from Europe and North America. It can be remembered that NATO Secretary Jens Stoltenberg has said that Ukraine could only join the alliance if it wins the war against Russia. Reporting, this has been Carlo de la Peña, SMNI News.